The conference room on the 14th floor of Whitmore and Cassidy smelled like old coffee and my mother's perfume. That sharp, floral Lancôme she'd worn since I was 7. I hadn't smelled it in 3 years. I smelled it now, and my stomach dropped before I even saw her face. She was already seated when I walked in. So was my sister. My mother looked up, and for a half-second I thought I saw something. Hesitation, maybe, or the ghost of it. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was the expression I knew better. Composed, deliberate, the face she wore for board meetings and charity galas, and any moment that required her to perform composure in front of witnesses. "You actually came," she said. Not a greeting. A verdict. My sister didn't look up at all. She was scrolling through her phone with the particular focused disinterest of someone who has decided, in advance, that you're not worth acknowledging. She was wearing a blazer I recognized, cream, structured, Aritzia. The kind of thing my mother would have bought her. I sat down across from them both. My hands were flat on the table. I made sure of it. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Pelletier, cleared his throat from the head of the table and said, without ceremony, "Shall we begin?" I had driven 4 hours from Sudbury to be in this room. I had taken 2 days off work that I could not really afford to take 2 days off from, not with a mortgage and a car payment, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from building something from nothing with no safety net. I had ironed my blazer 3 times the night before. I had called my best friend at 11 p.m. from the parking lot of my building, and she had said, "You don't owe them anything. Remember that, whatever happens in there, you don't owe them a single thing." I had believed her then. Sitting here now, watching my mother arrange her hands in her lap like she was settling in for a performance she'd already rehearsed, I was less sure. Mr. Pelletier opened the folder. That's when my mother said it. "I want it on record," she said, her voice perfectly level, "that I intend to contest any portion of this estate that has been allocated to her." A pause. A single word, landing like a stone dropped in still water. She was never really part of this family. Everyone in this room knows it. The air went out. My sister finally looked up. She didn't contradict her. She turned back to her phone. I didn't cry. I had cried enough in the years before this room, in parking lots and bathroom stalls, and on the phone with my best friend who always answered, no matter what time it was. I had used up those tears already. What I had left was something harder and quieter, and I held on to it with both hands. I thought about my father. I thought about the last time I saw him. Not in the hospital, not at the end, but before that. He had driven up to Sudbury without telling anyone, showed up at my door. On a Tuesday afternoon in November, with a Tim Hortons bag, and that specific sheepish expression he wore. Whenever he knew he'd handled something badly, he stood in my doorway in his old Carhartt jacket and said, "I just wanted to see the place." I let him in. I made him tea. He sat at my kitchen table and looked around at the mismatched furniture I'd found at Value Village, and the shelves I'd built myself, and the framed print of Lake Superior I'd hung crooked and never bothered to fix. He didn't say much. He drank his tea. Before he left, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm proud of what you've made here." And then he got in his truck and drove the 4 hours back to Ottawa. He never said anything like it before. He never said anything like it again. 3 months later, he was gone. I need to go back. Not to the conference room, not yet. Back further, to the part that made the conference room possible. I grew up in a house in the glebe that smelled like fresh paint and ambition. My father was a civil engineer who had built bridges across northern Ontario before he built a small consulting firm in Ottawa that grew, over 20 years, into something significant. My mother managed the social architecture of our family with the same precision he applied to load-bearing structures. Everything was calibrated. Dinner parties for the right people. The right school, the right extracurriculars, the right friends. My sister fit. She was made for it, or made herself for it. I was never sure which. She played piano. She graduated from Queens. She went into finance and married a man who worked for a lobbying firm on Elgin Street and had opinions about golf courses. My mother introduced her at parties as my daughter in wealth management, with a particular inflection that suggested the rest of the sentence, the part she didn't say out loud, was, "And then there's the other one." The other one was me. I was the one who didn't photograph well at fundraisers, who wore the wrong thing to the Christmas party and fixed it 1 year by not going at all, who told my parents at 19, sitting at the dining room table on a Sunday afternoon, with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, that I wanted to go to trade school, that I wanted to be an electrician. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I counted the seconds. I got to 11 before my mother said, "That's not something we do." My father said nothing. He looked at the table. I went anyway. Algonquin College, 2 years, then an apprenticeship with a company in Sudbury that did commercial work. Hospitals, schools, government buildings. I was one of 3 women in my cohort. I learned to read blueprints in conditions that were not designed for reading blueprints. I worked in the cold and the dark and the noise, and I was good at it, and eventually I was very good at it. And eventually after that I started my own small company with a woman I'd met in my 2nd year. And we built it slowly and carefully, and with the specific stubbornness of people who have been told they won't. None of this made it back to the dinner parties in the Christmas. My mother called once a year. My sister and I exchanged the occasional obligatory text. My father called sometimes, without warning, from his truck on the way home from a site visit. Those were the calls I saved. He talked about the work. He understood the work. He'd ask about specific jobs we were running, ask follow-up questions about the technical problems, remember details from conversations weeks later. When I won a contract for a new community center in Nickel Belt, he called to say congratulations and asked about the electrical design. He sounded genuinely interested. He was genuinely interested. I didn't know what to do with that, in the context of a family that had otherwise made clear that what I did was not interesting. One Easter, I was 26, home for the first time in 2 years. My mother hosted a dinner. My sister was there with her husband. My aunt and uncle came up from Kingston. There were neighbors I didn't recognize, friends of my parents, whose names I'd forgotten. I wore clean jeans and a button-down because I didn't own the kind of clothes the occasion seemed to require. And I watched my mother introduce me to the neighbors as our younger daughter. She works with the same tone she might have used to describe a piece of furniture she didn't know what to do with. Later, in the kitchen, my aunt put her hand on my arm and said quietly, "Your dad talks about your company all the time. He shows people your website." I didn't know what to do with that either. The hardest part was the Christmas I missed. Not by choice. We had a job running over deadline, a school that needed to pass electrical inspection before the new year, a crew counting on the overtime hours. I called on December 24th from the job site, still in my work clothes, standing in a parking lot in -22. My sister answered. She said, "Oh, we're in the middle of dinner. I'll have Mom call you back." Mom never called back. I found out later, through my aunt, that my father had set a place for me at the table, that he'd asked twice if anyone had heard from me, that when they cleared the plates, the empty place setting had stayed there until my mother quietly removed it. My aunt told me this a year after it happened. "I thought you should know," she said. He waited. I filed that away with the other things I didn't know how to carry. The phone calls from the truck, the visit to Sudbury, the website he apparently showed to people. The pieces of a person I was only allowed to see in fragments. He had a heart attack in February. I was on a site when my sister called. She said it the way she said most things. Efficiently, without inflection, like she was relaying information, rather than news. "Dad's in the ICU at the Civic. It's serious. Mom wanted me to let you know." I drove straight through. 5 hours in a February snowstorm, the kind that turns the 17 into a single lane of white nothing. I got to the hospital at 2 in the morning. My mother was in the waiting room in her coat, perfectly put together, and she looked at me when I walked in and said, "There was no need to rush." I stayed for 6 weeks. My sister came and went. She had obligations. I understood that. I told myself I understood that. But the obligations seemed to expand and contract based on what was convenient. She was there for the first week, then she was back in Ottawa handling things. She called once a day, sometimes, and my mother relayed information to her, in the careful shorthand of two people who have always understood each other without effort. I handled the things that needed handling. I sat with my father through the long afternoons when he was too tired to talk and too restless to sleep. I learned the medication schedule, the physiotherapy timeline, the names of the nurses on each shift. I asked the questions that needed asking and took notes on the answers. I brought him the crossword puzzle from the Citizen every morning, because he'd done the crossword every morning for 40 years. And the routine seemed to anchor him. One afternoon, about 3 weeks in, he looked at me from his bed and said, "You didn't have to do this." "I know," I said. "I'm glad you did." That was the whole conversation, but I kept it. He came home eventually. He was not the same. He needed help he would not have asked for on his own, and I stayed to provide it. Not because anyone asked me to, but because there was no one else, and because I could not have left him in that house with my mother, who managed his recovery the way she managed everything. With efficiency and without warmth, she arranged the home care appointments, and the follow-up visits and the physiotherapy schedule. And she did it capably. And she did not once sit on the edge of his bed in the afternoon and just be there. I went back to Sudbury in April. My business partner, who had been carrying the load alone, met me at the office with 2 coffees and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Okay, good, I'd be worried if you said yes." We drank our coffees and went back to work. My father died in September. Not another heart attack. Pneumonia, which they told us was a complication of the cardiac damage, which felt like a technicality, like the universe delivering the same verdict through a different mechanism. I found out at 6 in the morning from my mother, who called and said, "He passed about an hour ago. I'll let you know about the arrangements," and hung up before I could respond. I sat on my kitchen floor for a while. Then I called my business partner, who came over without asking, who sat with me on the kitchen floor for half an hour, without saying much, who eventually made eggs, because it was 6 in the morning, and neither of us had eaten. The funeral was held in Ottawa. I wore my one good dress and stood in the receiving line and shook hands with people who said things about my father that were true but felt inadequate. And I nodded and thanked them, and held it together until my aunt found me outside the church afterward. And then I didn't hold it together anymore. She held my hand while I cried in the parking lot. She didn't say anything useful, just stayed there, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. 3 weeks after the funeral, Mr. Pelletier's office called. "I already told you about the conference room. Let me tell you what happened after my mother said what she said." Mr. Pelletier looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "Mrs. Carmichael, I'd ask you to allow me to proceed." He had the particular diplomatic firmness of someone who has been in rooms like this before. He looked back down at the folder. My father had left the house, the one I grew up in, the one my mother considered hers by any measure that mattered to her, to be sold, with the proceeds split between my mother, my sister, and me. The consulting firm, which he had transferred into a holding company 2 years before, was to be managed by an executor until his existing contracts concluded, then wound down, with the net proceeds similarly distributed. And then there was the other thing. Mr. Pelletier set down a separate envelope, sealed. My name on it. In my father's handwriting. He asked that this be given to you directly, Mr. Pelletier said, in the presence of the other beneficiaries. My mother's eyes went to the envelope. Something moved across her face. "What is that?" my sister said. "Not a question. A demand." "A personal document," Mr. Pelletier said. "Your father's instructions were specific." I picked up the envelope. My hands were steady. I was aware of both of them watching me. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, handwritten on the graph paper my father always used for notes. He bought it in bulk from an engineering supply store, the same kind he'd used her for as long as I could remember. His handwriting was worse than it had been, shakier, but still recognizable. He wrote about the drive to Sudbury. He wrote about sitting at my kitchen table and looking at the shelves I'd built and thinking about the work I'd done without anyone's help. And feeling something he said he didn't have a name for at the time, but had since identified as recognizing yourself in someone. He wrote, "I was an engineer who built things. You're an engineer who builds things. I spent too many years letting your mother define what that was allowed to look like, and I am sorry for that. I am sorry it took me so long to say so out loud. I said it in other ways. I said it badly. In the ways available to me. But I know that doesn't fix the years it wasn't said clearly." He wrote about the website. He said he showed it to everyone. He said he'd told his oldest colleague, a man he'd worked with since 1987, that his daughter ran an electrical contracting company in Northern Ontario and that she'd built it from nothing, and that his colleague had said, "You must be proud." And that my father had said more than I know how to say. He wrote, at the end, "I should have told you that myself. I should have told you 100 times. I hope this reaches you before it's too late to matter, even a little." I looked up. My mother's face was completely still. My sister had set down her phones. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I folded the letter carefully. I put it back in the envelope. "Are we done?" I asked Mr. Pelletier. He nodded. "That concludes the reading of the estate." My mother stood. "I'll be in touch with our legal counsel," she said, to Mr. Pelletier, not to me. "This distribution is not what was discussed." "You're welcome to pursue that," Mr. Pelletier said mildly. "Your husband's instructions were very clear." In the elevator on the way down, my sister stood beside me in silence for 11 floors. Just before the lobby, she said, "You know she's going to fight this." "I know," I said. "It's going to get ugly." "I know." The doors opened. I walked out first. It did get ugly. My mother retained a lawyer in Ottawa, someone from a firm my sister's husband had connections to, and filed a challenge to the estate distribution on the grounds that my father's capacity had been compromised in his final months. They submitted the medical records. They submitted statements from 2 of their friends, people I'd met maybe 6 times in my life, attesting to his confusion and frailty. I submitted the crossword puzzles, 47 of them, from the months I'd been in Ottawa, each dated in his handwriting in the corner, each one finished. I submitted the notes I'd taken at his medical appointments. Detailed, specific, the kind of notes a person takes when they are following the conversation. I submitted the records from his physiotherapy, where the therapist had noted his engagement and his questions and his progress. I submitted a statement from his oldest colleague, the one my father had told about my company. He wrote 3 pages about the conversation they'd had. 6 my father had described the letter he was writing to me. He wrote, he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly what he was doing. He'd thought about it for years. And then there was my aunt. I hadn't known she was coming. She showed up at the mediation appointment. A cold Tuesday in January, a boardroom in an office building on Spark Street, with a folder under her arm and a look on her face that I recognized from the church parking lot. Steady, decided. She had kept everything, every email my father had sent her, over 8 years, beginning the November after I'd left for trade school, in which he wrote about me with a consistency and a detail that made clear he had been paying attention to every step. He wrote about the apprenticeship and the company and the contracts and the things I'd told him on the phone calls from his truck. He wrote, in one email from 4 years ago, I've made mistakes with her that I don't know how to fix. But I'm watching, and I want her to know I'm watching, even when I don't know how to say it. My mother's lawyer looked at the folder for a long time. The challenge was withdrawn 6 weeks later. I am writing this from the kitchen of my apartment in Sudbury. It is March. Outside, the snow is doing what snow does in northern Ontario in March. It's here and then it isn't. Ice patches in the morning, melt by afternoon, a kind of reluctant seasonal negotiation. I did not take the money and move somewhere warmer. I thought about it. My business partner made a joke about me finally being able to afford a jacket that wasn't from Canadian Tire, and I laughed, and then I went home and thought seriously about what I actually wanted. What I wanted was to keep building things. We've hired 2 more electricians. A new health center, significant, the kind of contract we would not have been eligible for a year ago. I've been mentoring an apprentice, a 22-year-old from Elliott Lake, who reminds me of myself in that specific way that makes you want to make things easier for them without making things too easy. My mother and I have not spoken. I don't know if we will. I've stopped trying to predict it. My sister texted me in February. It said, "I didn't know about the emails. I just wanted you to know that." I read it 3 times. I didn't respond for a week. Then I wrote back, "Thank you for telling me." I don't know what that is or what it becomes. Something, maybe. The beginning of something very small. I'm holding it carefully. The way you hold something you're not sure will survive the handling. My aunt calls on Sundays. We talk about her garden and my work and sometimes about my father, the good memories, the ones that belong to both of us, the ones that don't require explanation or excavation. The letter is in the top drawer of my desk, still in the envelope. In the folder I've started keeping for things I want to be able to find. I read it sometimes, late at night when the building is quiet. He said, I said it in other ways. I think about that. The drive to Sudbury. The website he showed to everyone. The place setting he left at the table. The 47 crossword puzzles, dated in the corner, finished. I think about my apprentice, who showed up last week with a question about conduit bending that she'd been working through on her own, who had half the answer already, who just needed someone to confirm she was on the right track. And I thought, this is what he was doing, showing up at the door, sending emails my aunt saved for 8 years, waiting at the table. He didn't know how to say it directly. He said it every way he could. I'm learning to build things with pieces that didn't arrive the way you needed them to, that you had to figure out how to use anyway. It's not the material you would have chosen, but it holds.